I've been dying to make a video about Final Fantasy VII Remake since its release, and the more I've thought about it, the more nuanced I constantly find the subject becomes. Thankfully, I've come to some understanding about everything that makes this game so difficult for me to elaborate on. But before I do, I have a question for you. Who remembers our first dog? You do? Good. After watching the new PS5 FF7 Remake trailer, it got me thinking on Square Enix design choices over the years and why I think they are never going to put out a new original Final Fantasy title that's going to blow away the majority of gamers ever again. Not like 6, 7, or Chrono Trigger did anyway. They will still make good games, great games, but a new masterpiece that blows away expectations of everyone and sets a new bar for JRPGs?
I'll kill you if it's the last thing I do.
I'm sorry. It's like my throat was thirsty for air.
Well, I'm not too sure. Saying that, I have to clarify I absolutely love playing through the FF7 Remake, and in many ways, it has set new bars for JRPGs, specifically its combat mechanics and how well they adapted the old materia system to fit perfectly within it. Granted, the combat was not 100% flawless, air combat needs work, and the interrupting boss cutscenes that can occur when you're about to pull off a limit break were definitely annoyances with me too. But hey, this combat was the first of its kind, and for a first attempt I still believe it's really exceptional, and I certainly look forward to more. But as we all know, the original FF7 was loved for far more than its combat. It was the story, it was the music, it was the cinematic cutscenes. But what's occurring to me is how much better it was for having the graphics it had. Not even these graphics, or these graphics. These graphics played such a huge role in how good the original was, and we don't even realize it. Much of the criticism I remember hearing about the FF7 Remake is how highly anime the whole game feels. And I agree, it does. Most of all, the dialogue itself. When you listen to this game played in English, which I'm sure many if not most have, how could you not say this game feels anime-like?
I know you can!
Especially when companies like Rockstar and Naughty Dog have dialogue in their games that feels much more natural. I get it. But saying this reminds you of anime, I think is a poor way of perceiving this, because it's a Japanese company comprised of Japanese staff writing Japanese dialogue that will be brought to life by Japanese animators. In a sense, it is an anime, because it's filled with every core ingredient an anime has. Just because this is a video game out of Japan and not a television series, doesn't mean it can suddenly avoid all the nuances of their language and culture coming into effect. It's going to remind you of an anime, because it has no choice but to come off as an anime. I mean, look at his hair, no shit. But the original definitely less so, and that was the brilliance of its presentation. I mean, objectively, if we look at these characters, they kinda look like strange, blocky dolls made for children. They're not too intricate in detail, they're bright and colorful, and they lack things like fingers. So when you look at something like this presented in a way where it's speaking and essentially performing, there's this level of objectivity in your mind that gets turned off compared to when you're looking at something like this. And when they have no voiceover to deliver the dialogue, that's even less objectivity and scrutiny coming from the audience. Instead, you give them a voice in your mind, and the tone of their words is supplemented by the tone of the music in the background. The music fills in the blank space of whatever the current scene's atmosphere is. If it needs to be funny, sad, mysterious, or uplifting, the music fulfills that requirement, and we as the audience just experience it that way. I also think they don't look fully chibi either, because most chibi are known for having rounded edges, which gives them an extra harmless look. That visual distinction, whether intentional or not, I think is important, because when they say menacing things to each other, visually, they look a little more so the part. For Sephiroth, when he starts messing with Cloud's head, and not only convincing him, but you as a player, that Cloud may have never really existed, how funny and cute did the visual style come off then? How much did the scene lack for not having a voiceover? But yet despite that, it can also pull off this, and this, and this. The visual style of the original is just far more flexible when it comes to performing in various ways while maintaining a sense of plausibility. No, I won't say I didn't enjoy many of the revamped scenes in the remake, like Cloud's visit to the Honeybee Inn. I did. But the only reason I was going along with it honestly is because the original was able to pull it off so well in the first place. But the moods in these scenes don't mix. Like, Would you take Joel as seriously in The Last of Us if he dressed up in a lederhosen and started dancing for Ellie with a full band behind him? How much would a bizarre occurrence like that weigh in on your mind for what happens later? That's just it, because Final Fantasy VII Remake does silly, absurd things like this all the time, but then asks you to take it seriously, and a lot of people just can't. Animes are also known for this extended range of atmosphere within, going from silly to serious. For example, the Full Metal Alchemist animes are some of the most widely beloved anime series ever. It gets incredibly dark, incredibly emotional, and has this gag where you see Ebert turn into this little angry gremlin of a creature whenever someone calls him short. It doesn't adversely affect the overall series like it can for FF7 Remake, because the design and look of the characters allow for this flexibility. This is one of anime's greatest strengths, that none of the modern day Final Fantasies have. They all like to get ridiculous at times, because the series always has. But when they looked like this, it had that flexibility. Changing the characters to look like this means you sacrifice the ability of being overly lighthearted, and when you mix in the ultra ridiculous with the ultra serious, people start taking the game as serious as the Yakuza series. The artistic direction of Final Fantasy VIII with more lifelike looking characters has for a good while now reigned supreme, mostly because when the series tried to revert for Final Fantasy IX, the sales figures paled in comparison. As a result, Square has since stuck with more realistic characters, and while they always look pretty stunning even from the very beginning, the tones of the games have suffered for it. Everyone made fun of Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy XII,
I'm Captain Bash from Dalmasca,
definitely Final Fantasy XIII, and I gave up on Final Fantasy XV. And while each of these games are pretty good in their own right for different reasons, collectively none of them are being raved about for what a masterpiece any of them are, unlike 6, 7, and Chrono Trigger. And this trend is clearly continuing. Every game gets viewed with higher and higher objectivity as the graphics continue to increase. But none of them have reached the status of the series' best. But at the same time, I understand why everyone, myself included, wanted to experience a Final Fantasy VII that looked like this, because in the original, we saw a glimpse of it. So many years ago, in those fleeting moments where we saw them in a more human form, we could only imagine how it could have been if this whole amazing game we just experienced could have looked this epic. The reality is, it just doesn't work as well. Limiting the amount of time we see more lifelike looking versions of the main characters, I think is the best way it could have ever been used. It kept the more serious looking character models for the game's most serious moments, and even when they didn't, the flexibility of the blocky character models still masterfully delivered a believable narrative that everyone loved. However, saying all this, I realize the issues I point out in this game aren't at all the issues several of the old fans had with the remake. They were upset that this game isn't really a remake. But I don't believe Final Fantasy VII Remake was worse off for being a non-identical experience. I 100% believe the opposite, and I think for the overall lasting success of this title, the big moves Nomura made were the right ones. In 1998, a remake of one of the most famous movies of all time came out, and I bet most everyone forgot about it. It was for Psycho, the 1960 classic horror film by Alfred Hitchcock. This movie was nearly a shot-for-shot reconstruction of the original, with all the same dialogue.
I just pulled over. Have I broken any laws?
I just pulled over. Have I broken any laws?
And of course, yeah, the gruesome murder. I find this particularly interesting since this was a remake of a seriously legendary film for its time, and back in the 90s, remakes were a lot less common. Yet despite that, it had mediocre results in the box office, only making a little over half of what it cost to produce, and the reviews for it were also underwhelming.
What I really feel is if you want to see Psycho, it's obvious. Rent the original.
Very underappreciated by the masses, but it was loyal to the original. Speaking about a remake loyal to the original, I can think of one that came out recently, Trials of Mana, the legendary Super Famicom title we never got at initial release in the States, now remade to have 3D graphics that present the original story, note for note, but with today's modern capability. Spoiler alert, it's not as good, not even by a long shot.
Look!
Feast your eyes on my multiplying trick! Ta-da!
Ooh, wow.
Much like adding color to the original 1960s Psycho, adding 3D to the once 2D classic is underwhelming. It's faithful, and that's good, but just good nowadays?
Wow.
Is forgettable. And if we're talking about unforgettable, who's still thinking about their first dog? I certainly know I am. And for 5-year-old me who never before experienced a dog's personality, Marshall was the sweetest and most incredible creature I ever knew existed. And for me now, decades later, when I measure how loving or sweet any dog is, I compare them to Marshall. Marshall set the standard. Final Fantasy VII originally wasn't the greatest because it followed a beaten path or was something that lived up to your expectations because you weren't expecting it. Many of us didn't even know what an RPG was, let alone the Final Fantasy series. And while there are already other fantastic RPGs that had reached America to include entries to Final Fantasy, it took 7 to make everyone take notice. It was the new experience, just like your first dog. For the remake of Final Fantasy VII to be memorable in its own right, it's far more likely to achieve that goal if it's a new game altogether. It's not just about Square Enix placing their once winning formula into the Unreal 4 engine, it's about remaking the wonder it brought along. It were the things about Final Fantasy VII that people never experienced before that blew away our minds. But to achieve that sensation, they had to make new wonder. 7's amazing story and plot twists certainly worked for then. But when the world knows it already, the world knows it already. Sticking that exact sequence in a modern day game isn't going to blow anyone's mind. Just like the Psycho remake, and that even had Vince Vaughn. Just like FF7, that movie couldn't have been more groundbreaking at the time. It couldn't have been more genre defying. And now how many people are talking about its remake? Me, because no one is. A remake wasn't the goal. Square Enix's goal was to remake something as revolutionary. Because FF7 rocked everyone's world, it still had the expectation to do so once more, which Square Enix doesn't always do. But as any great artist knows, it's our mistakes that make us better. And Square Enix has had a ton of those. From unusually bad and jarring dialogue, annoying side characters, underwhelming game progression, and incompetent buggy messes. They honestly paid off in a lot of ways. It wasn't just me who loves the new combat for Final Fantasy VII Remake, combat largely resembling elements of Final Fantasy XIII with its stagger mechanic. It wasn't amazing back then, but it's much better now. This wasn't so great back then either, but it got better over time. This guy has received a ton of shit over the years, to which I mostly agree with, but you know, maybe he may yet have a few surprises for us all, and that's what we should look forward to, because there the real excitement lies. But some may say, well, by changing the story, they are ruining it for new audiences. Are they? It's not like Final Fantasy VII is hard to get a hold of these days. But would it hold up for modern day audiences? The young audiences? It did for this 8-year-old. The original Final Fantasy VII was still quite effective. Because these are still effective. These little polygonal characters, these simple lines of dialogue, these simple animations to show action or convey feeling, and this unforgettable soundtrack that so masterfully set the tone. When it comes to fascinating a young mind, even today, decades later, it's still as capable as it ever was. That's why when it comes to telling the incredible story of Final Fantasy VII, Once was enough. What Squaresoft made was enough. This new game didn't have to be that beat for beat, and if it were, it would have ended up being another 1998 Psycho remake, forgotten. Remaking this game came with a tremendous opportunity to impress, and I for one think Square Enix was right to take the chance. One more thing I want you all to consider. Now, as you have grown throughout your lives, I'm sure one thing you learned about along the way is life has no guarantees, especially when it comes to what you want. The person you fancy could turn you down. The job you're after may hire somebody else. The job you have, you may lose. That widespread pandemic you would never see coming has. A Final Fantasy VII Remake was never guaranteed. I would hope that every old fan who played this game took a minute to realize the fact you're alive today and have a decent enough life to where you could play this game is a blessing. And the fact it's at least as enjoyable as it is, given Square Enix's many missteps, is almost unbelievable. I've known fans of the original Final Fantasy VII that didn't live to see this day. I think about what this would have meant to them. As far as I'm concerned, this game is quite possibly the funnest action RPG I ever played, combined with the fact it has the name Final Fantasy VII attached to it, and I have more of it to look forward to.